In the shadow of a quiet industrial town, a lone factory worker stumbles upon a buried secret that will unravel everything he knows about courage, survival, and betrayal. When Matthew unearths a mysterious wooden box in the forest, he discovers Lila, a young woman left for dead, bound by a dark conspiracy. Together, they must evade powerful enemies, expose deadly truths, and fight for justice against impossible odds. Lives will collide, trust will be tested, and second chances will be earned in a heart-pounding journey of resilience and redemption. How far would you go to uncover the truth? But before diving, let me know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button because we'll be bringing you more amazing gift tomorrow. Now let's start this journey together. The night air was cool and heavy with the scent of damp earth as Matthew Jones trudged along the winding forest path. His boots crunched softly against the gravel, the rhythmic sound blending with the faint rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. The shortcut through Briarwood Trail shaved a good 20 minutes off his walk home, a precious gift after a grueling 12-hour shift at the factory. Matthew adjusted the strap of his worn backpack and exhaled, watching his breath form pale clouds in the moonlight. The factory was a demanding place, its relentless pace leaving his muscles sore and his mind foggy. But the path through the forest always brought him peace, a quiet reprieve from the clamor of machines and the monotony of his daily grind. Tonight, however, something felt different. As Matthew rounded the familiar bend near the old oak tree, a low rumble reached his ears. He stopped, his brow furrowing as he strained to listen. The unmistakable hum of an engine broke the stillness, growing louder with every second. His pulse quickened. The path was secluded, rarely traveled by anyone at this hour. He ducked into the underbrush, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. Peering through the dense foliage, Matthew spotted the source of the noise. A van, its dull headlights slicing through the darkness. The vehicle rolled to a halt at the edge of a small clearing, its tires crunching against the dirt. Matthew's breath caught as the van's doors swung open, and 3 men stepped out. They moved quickly, their voices low but urgent. One of them carried a shovel, while another hauled what looked like a large wooden crate. The third man, taller than the rest and dressed in a dark coat, barked orders as the others began to dig. "What the hell are they doing?" Matthew whispered to himself, pressing lower into the shadows. The scene unfolded with an eerie sense of urgency. The men worked in tense synchronization, the shovel slicing into the earth with swift, practiced movements. The tall man paced nearby, his sharp silhouette illuminated by the van's headlights. His voice carried a commanding tone, urging the others to move faster. Matthew's chest tightened as he watched them lower the crate into the freshly dug hole. The thud of its impact resonated in the silent forest, sending a shiver down his spine. The men began to cover the box with soil, their actions almost mechanical in their precision. One of them muttered something under his breath, his tone edged with frustration, but the tall man cut him off sharply. "Hurry it up," he snapped, his voice slicing through the night. "We don't have all night." Matthew's instinct screamed at him to stay hidden, to wait until the men left and continue home. But his curiosity gnawed at him, refusing to let go. What could possibly be inside that box? Why the secrecy? As the van's engine roared to life, Matthew pressed himself further into the underbrush. The headlights swept across the clearing one last time before the vehicle disappeared down the trail, leaving the forest in an oppressive silence. Matthew emerged cautiously from his hiding spot, his breathing shallow. The clearing seemed larger now, the freshly disturbed earth an ominous blemish on the landscape. His eyes fixed on the mound of dirt, his thoughts racing. "Don't do it," he muttered under his breath. "This isn't your problem." But the questions nagged at him, relentless and unyielding. What had those men buried? Why in the middle of nowhere? What if it was something or someone that needed help? Matthew dropped his bag and knelt by the patch of disturbed earth. His hands trembled as he began clawing at the soil, the cool dirt caking his fingers. Each handful of earth brought him closer to the truth. though he wasn't sure he wanted to find it. "This is stupid," he muttered, but his hands didn't stop. Minutes felt like hours as he dug, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Finally, his fingers scraped against wood. The crate. He wiped the sweat from his brow and sat back for a moment, staring at the roughly built box. It was large and crudely made, with no markings to indicate its purpose. Matthew hesitated, his pulse hammering in his ears. This was it, the moment he could turn back, leave it untouched, and pretend he'd never seen it. But something deep inside him wouldn't let him walk away. He searched the edges of the crate, his fingers finding a loose corner. Gritting his teeth, he pried it open, the wood groaning in protest. With a final heave, the lid snapped free, crashing to the ground. What he saw inside made his stomach lurch. A young woman lay motionless, her wrists and ankles bound with coarse rope. Her face was pale and streaked with dirt, her hair damp and matted. For a moment, Matthew feared the worst, that she was already gone. "Hey," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "Hey, can you hear me?" He leaned closer, his hands trembling as he checked for any sign of life. A faint rise and fall of her chest caught his eye. She was breathing, though just barely. Relief and dread washed over him in equal measure. Matthew's mind raced. Who was she? How had she ended up here? And who were the men that had buried her alive? He worked quickly, his hands fumbling as he untied the ropes that bit into her wrists and ankles. Her skin was raw where the bindings had been, angry red marks standing out against her pale complexion. "You're okay," he murmured, though the words felt hollow. He had no idea if they were true. As he carefully lifted her out of the crate, her head lolled against his shoulder, her body unervingly light. His legs wobbled as he stood, the weight of her and the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. Matthew glanced around the clearing one last time, half expecting the van to return. But the forest remained eerily silent, the shadows stretching long and ominous in the moonlight. "Hold on," he whispered to the unconscious woman, adjusting her in his arms. "I've got you." He stumbled back onto the trail, his path illuminated only by the faint glow of the moon. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Matthew pushed forward, driven by a need he couldn't quite explain. The forest seemed to close in around him, the weight of the night and the events that had unfolded pressing against his chest. Yet, with every labored breath, he clung to the hope that this terrifying discovery could still lead to something good. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Matthew's boots pounded the uneven trail as he carried the unconscious woman through the forest. The night pressed in around him, thick and suffocating, every sound amplified by the silence. A snapping twig or the rustle of leaves in the wind made his pulse spike, his eyes darting to the shadows. The men who had buried her could return at any moment, and the thought gnawed at him relentlessly. "Stay with me," Matthew murmured to the woman, her head resting limply against his chest. She was alarmingly light, her breath so faint that he found himself holding his own each time he glanced at her pale face. His mind raced. He didn't know who she was, what had happened to her, or why those men had buried her alive. But one thing was certain. She couldn't stay here, and neither could he. The forest trail eventually opened up to the outskirts of Ashton, a small industrial town with narrow streets and rows of rundown apartments. Matthew's pace slowed as he approached the building where he lived. His one-bedroom unit was nothing special, just four walls, a rickety table, and a couch that doubled as a bed on most nights. But it was safe, at least for now. The woman stirred slightly as he maneuvered through the front door. Her faint movement jolted Matthew's focus, but she didn't wake. He laid her gently on the worn couch, careful not to disturb her any further. For the first time since digging her out of the box, Matthew allowed himself a moment to breathe. He leaned against the wall, running a hand through his disheveled hair. His body ached from the effort of carrying her, but it was the weight of what had just happened that bore down on him. "What do I do now?" he whispered to himself, staring at her fragile frame. The woman's wrists bore deep red marks from the ropes that had bound her, and faint bruises marred her temple. Dirt clung to her clothes, and her hair was matted with sweat. Whoever had done this to her had intended for her to die. Of that Matthew was certain. His hands hovered over his phone, his thumb poised to dial 911. Calling the authorities was the logical choice. They could take her to a hospital, investigate what had happened, and find the men responsible. But as his finger hovered over the screen, doubt crept in. Who would believe his story? A factory worker with no connections, finding a woman buried alive in the woods? They'd ask why he hadn't called sooner, why he hadn't left it alone. Worse, the men who buried her might realize she'd escaped. If they found out she was alive, and that he was the one who had intervened, it wouldn't just be her life at risk. The woman let out a faint, pained moan, breaking Matthew's spiral of thought. He set the phone down and knelt beside her, brushing dirt from her cheek with a trembling hand. "You're okay," he said softly, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure her or himself. "You're safe now." He grabbed a damp cloth from the kitchen and began cleaning the grime from her face and hands. The dirt gave way to bruises and shallow cuts, each one a silent testament to whatever horrors she had endured. "Who are you?" he murmured, glancing at her closed eyes. As he worked, fragments of possible explanations flickered through his mind. She could be a victim of some horrific crime, a kidnapper's hostage, or the unfortunate witness to something terrible. Or maybe she had stumbled into something far bigger than herself, the way he now feared he had. The hours dragged by, each one weighed down by uncertainty. Matthew couldn't bring himself to sleep, instead pacing the small room and glancing out the window every few minutes. The street below was quiet, but his paranoia painted threats in every shadow. Near dawn, the woman stirred. A sharp intake of breath made Matthew whirl around, his pulse quickening. Her eyelids fluttered open, unfocused at first, before her gaze locked onto him. "Hey," he said gently, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "It's okay. You're safe." She tried to sit up, but her arms gave out beneath her. Panic flared in her wide eyes, her breath shallow and rapid. Where am I?" she croaked, her voice raw. "You're in my apartment," Matthew said, keeping his tone steady. "I found you. In the woods." "You were," he hesitated, unsure how much to say. "You were hurt. I brought you here." Her hand flew to her neck, then her wrists, as if searching for the ropes that had bound her. Her fingers brushed the raw marks, and she winced. "The box," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They put me in the box." Matthew's chest tightened. "Do you remember who did this to you?" Her brow furrowed as she searched her fragmented memory. "There were men, 2 of them. They grabbed me after the gala." Her voice broke, and tears welled in her eyes. Matthew pulled a chair closer, leaning in slightly, but giving her space. "A gala?" She nodded weakly, her fingers gripping the edge of the couch. "It was for my father's company. I left early. Too many people. I just wanted to go home." Her breaths came faster as she continued. "When I got in my car, they were waiting. Her voice cracked, and she shook her head. "I don't know why. They just said I saw too much." Matthew's stomach twisted. "Do you know their names?" "What they wanted." She closed her eyes, frustration etched into her face. "I don't know. Everything's blurry. But one of them, he called the other Victor." The name landed heavily in the room, though it meant nothing to Matthew. "Victor," he repeated, filing it away. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she looked at him. "I thought I was going to die. They drugged me, tied me up, and then the box. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe." Hey, Matthew interrupted gently, his voice steady. "You're out now. They can't hurt you here." She nodded, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. "Why didn't you take me to a hospital?" Matthew hesitated, weighing his answer carefully. "I wanted to, but the way you looked, I didn't know if the police would think I had something to do with it. And whoever did this, they might still be out there. I couldn't risk them finding you again." Her gaze softened, though fear lingered in her expression. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For what?" "For not leaving me there." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what had happened settling over them. Finally, Matthew spoke. "What's your name?" "Lila," she said softly, her voice steadier now. "Lila Carter." Matthew nodded, the name solidifying her presence in his mind. I'm Matthew. Matthew, she repeated, her lips forming a faint, grateful smile. Though neither said it aloud, they both understood that this was far from over. The men who had buried her wouldn't stop searching. But for now, Lila was alive, and Matthew was determined to keep it that way. The first rays of dawn filtered through the thin curtains of Matthew's apartment, casting a soft glow over the room. Lila sat on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest, clutching a warm cup of tea Matthew had made for her. The delicate steam curled around her face, but it did little to ease the tension in her clenched jaw or the haunted look in her eyes. Matthew watched her from the nearby chair, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. He hadn't asked anything more since she'd shared her name last night, giving her space to gather herself. But now, the silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. I should probably explain, Lila murmured finally, her voice still hoarse. Matthew straightened, but didn't interrupt, sensing this was something she needed to do at her own pace. She stared into her cup, as though the swirling liquid might hold the answers. It started 2 nights ago. My father. He's a businessman, owns Carter Enterprises. They threw a gala at the Ashton Heights Hotel, one of those extravagant events with too much champagne and fake smiles. Her lips twitched into a humorless smile before fading. I wasn't planning to go, but my stepmother insisted. Said it was important for me to make an appearance. Matthew leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. Why didn't you want to go? Lila hesitated, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Crowds aren't my thing. I've spent most of my life in the shadow of my father's company, smiling, shaking hands, pretending I belonged. It's exhausting. Matthew nodded, but didn't push. The night was fine at first, she continued, her voice quieter. Dull but fine. I mingled, took pictures, did what was expected of me. But then, she paused, her grip tightening on the cup. Then I saw something I wasn't supposed to. Matthew's brow furrowed. What did you see? Lila's eyes darted toward the window, as if the shadows outside might hold the answer. There was a man. I didn't recognize him, but he was arguing with Victor, my stepbrother. Her voice trembled as she said his name, and Matthew didn't miss the way her knuckles whitened. Victor, he repeated, testing the name. She nodded. He's my father's son from his first marriage. We've never been close. He resented me from the moment my mom and I moved into their house. To him, we were intruders. What was he arguing about? Matthew asked gently. I don't know exactly, Lila admitted. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but their voices were raised. Something about a deal gone wrong, someone finding out too much. She shook her head, her voice growing more strained. The next thing I knew, the other man was on the floor, bleeding. And Victor was holding the knife. Matthew's breath caught. You saw him kill someone? Lila nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I panicked. I tried to leave quietly, but he saw me. He froze, just for a second, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes. It wasn't fear or regret. It was anger. She set the cup down, her hands trembling too much to hold it. I ran, thinking I could get to my car before he reached me. But when I got to the parking lot, there were 2 men waiting, his lackeys. They grabbed me, put something over my mouth, and everything went black. Matthew clenched his fists, the thought of what she had endured igniting a surge of anger in his chest. And then you woke up in that box. Lila nodded again, her voice barely audible. They must have drugged me. When I came to, I was already bound. I could hear Victor's voice, telling them to bury me, to make it look like I disappeared. He said I was a loose end. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. If you hadn't found me, you don't have to think about that. Matthew interrupted firmly, his tone soft but resolute. You're here now. They didn't win. Lila lowered her hands, looking at him with red-rimmed eyes. Why did you do it? You could have walked away. You should have walked away. Matthew hesitated, the question catching him off guard. I couldn't, he said finally. Not after seeing what they did to you. I didn't know if anyone else would. Her gaze softened, the edges of her fear easing as she studied him. Thank you, she whispered. Matthew gave a small nod, but his jaw tightened. We're not out of this yet. Victor knows you're alive now, or he'll figure it out soon enough. He won't stop looking. Lila shivered at the thought. What do we do? Matthew leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. First we lay low. The longer they think you're gone, the better chance we have to figure this out. Figure what out? Why Victor killed that man, and why he was so desperate to cover it up, Matthew said. If we can prove what happened, he won't be able to touch you. Lila stared at him, her expression wavering between hope and doubt. How are we supposed to do that? He has power, money, everything, and I have nothing. You have the truth, Matthew said firmly. And you have me. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue, but no words came. Instead, she nodded, a faint flicker of trust in her eyes. Outside, the sun climbed higher, bathing the room in a fragile warmth that did little to dispel the weight of what they were facing. Matthew crossed to the window, his gaze sweeping over the street below. It was quiet for now, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't stay that way for long. Lila, he said, turning back to her, I need you to think hard. Did you hear anything else? A name, a location, anything that might help us understand what Victor is involved. And she closed her eyes, her brow furrowing in concentration. There was something when I was in the box. One of the men, he said something about cleaning up the mess before Aurora got wind of it. Aurora? Matthew repeated, his mind churning. It's a company, Lila said, her voice growing steadier. One of Carter Enterprises' biggest competitors. But I don't know what they have to do with this. Matthew nodded, filing the information away. It's a start. Lila looked at him, her expression a mix of determination and fear. You really think we can stop him? Matthew's gaze hardened. We don't have a choice. For the first time since waking up on his couch, Lila managed a small, hesitant smile. In that moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. But deep down, both of them knew the storm was far from over. The day had barely started, but tension hung heavy in the air of Matthew's cramped apartment. He stood by the window, the blinds tilted just enough to give him a clear view of the street below. His gaze darted between parked cars and passing strangers, his instincts sharper than ever. Lila sat at the kitchen table, her fingers nervously tracing the edge of a mug of now-cold tea. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards as Matthew shifted his weight. They'll come looking, Lila murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthew didn't turn away from the window. I know. She looked at him, the fear in her eyes mirrored by the determination in his stance. What if they're already here? As if on cue, a sleek black sedan rounded the corner and slowed as it approached the building. Matthew stiffened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the windowsill. The car crawled to a stop just beyond his apartment, its tinted windows concealing whoever was inside. We've got company, Matthew said, his voice low but steady. Lila's chair scraped against the floor as she stood, her breath quickening. Are you sure it's them? Matthew glanced back at her. It's not exactly the kind of car you see in this neighborhood. Stay away from the window. She nodded, backing toward the couch as Matthew kept watch. The sedan idled for a moment before rolling forward and disappearing around the corner, but the unease it left behind lingered like a shadow. Matthew turned to Lila, his jaw tight. We need to leave. Lila hugged herself, her fingers gripping the sleeves of her borrowed sweatshirt. Where can we go? They'll find us no matter what. Not if we stay ahead of them, Matthew said firmly. Grab what you need. We'll figure it out as we go. The plan to slip out unnoticed quickly unraveled. As Matthew packed a small bag with essentials, the sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Heavy, deliberate footsteps. He froze, exchanging a tense glance with Lila. Get to the bedroom, he whispered. Now! She didn't argue, darting toward the narrow hallway as Matthew grabbed a wrench from the kitchen counter. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, followed by a sharp knock. Matthew Jones? A voice called, low and menacing. Matthew's grip tightened on the wrench. Who's asking? The door rattled violently as someone tried the handle. Open up, the voice demanded. We just want to talk. Yeah, I bet, Matthew muttered under his breath. A loud crash echoed through the apartment as the door splintered under a heavy kick. Two men stormed inside, their faces obscured by hoods. The first lunged at Matthew, but he swung the wrench with all his strength, catching the intruder in the shoulder. The man stumbled back with a grunt, but the second attacker was faster, slamming Matthew against the wall. Lila peeked out from the bedroom, her eyes wide with terror. "Run!" Matthew shouted, his voice strained as he struggled against the man pinning him. She hesitated for a split second before scrambling toward the fire escape outside the bedroom window. The sound of her footsteps on the metal ladder spurred Matthew on. He twisted, landing a desperate punch to his attacker's ribs before breaking free. The first man was recovering, reaching for something in his jacket. Matthew didn't wait to find out what. It was enough to send him sprinting toward the bedroom and out onto the fire escape. Lila was already halfway down, her breath ragged as she clung to the rickety ladder. "Keep going," Matthew urged, glancing over his shoulder. The men were at the window now, one of them pointing and shouting. They hit the ground running, weaving through alleys and side streets as the sound of footsteps and shouts faded into the distance. Adrenaline pumped through Matthew's veins, driving his legs forward even as his muscles screamed in protest. Finally, they ducked into a narrow alley behind a row of shuttered shops. Matthew pressed his back against the cold brick wall, trying to catch his breath. Lila leaned against him, trembling. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "For now," Matthew said, his voice low. He scanned the alley's entrance, his mind racing. "But they'll keep coming." By nightfall, the two had made their way to a seedy motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign buzzed faintly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked parking lot. Matthew paid in cash, keeping his head down as he took the key. The room was small and musty, with peeling wallpaper and a single flickering light bulb. Lila sank onto the edge of the bed, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "This place is awful," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "It's the kind of place no one asks questions," Matthew replied, locking the door and securing the chain. "We just need a few hours to figure out our next move." Lila nodded, though her expression remained distant. The weight of the day's events had settled heavily on her, her fear now mingled with exhaustion. Matthew pulled a chair to the window, sitting with his back to the wall as he watched the empty parking lot. His wrench lay on the small table beside him, a makeshift weapon that suddenly felt inadequate against the forces they were up against. "You should try to sleep," he said, glancing at Lila. She shook her head. "I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. I hear them." Her voice cracked, and she looked away. Matthew sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're safe for now," he said softly. "They don't know where we are." Lila met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "For how long?" He didn't have an answer. Instead, he reached for the map he had picked up at a gas station earlier. Spreading it out on the table, he traced potential routes with his finger, looking for somewhere they could disappear, a place where Victor's reach might not extend. As the hours stretched on, the room grew quieter, the tension thick but unspoken. Lila eventually lay down, her back to the room, and Matthew remained by the window, his eyes heavy but his resolve unbroken. The chase had begun, and they both knew it was only a matter of time before the next confrontation. The first light of dawn spilled through the thin curtains of the motel room, casting pale shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Matthew sat slumped in the corner, the chair beneath him creaking as he shifted. His eyes were bloodshot from a night spent staring out the window, every sound outside sending a jolt of tension through his body. On the bed, Lila stirred, the faint light rousing her from a restless sleep. She pushed herself upright, the dark circles under her eyes betraying how little rest she'd actually gotten. "You didn't sleep, did you?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Matthew shook his head, his gaze fixed on the parking lot. "Couldn't risk it," she sighed, pulling her knees to her chest. "We can't keep running forever." "I know," Matthew said, his tone grim. "But we need a plan first." As the day wore on, Matthew and Lila pieced together the fragments of what they knew about Victor. Lila recounted more details from the night of the gala, her memories surfacing in jagged pieces. It wasn't just the argument, she said, pacing the small room. There was something in Victor's voice. Desperation. He mentioned Aurora, that company I told you about, but it wasn't just competition. It was personal. Matthew frowned, sitting up straighter. What do you mean? She stopped, staring out the window. My father and Aurora's CEO, Lucas Graff, have been rivals for years. Victor used to complain about how my dad was obsessed with beating him, how it consumed his life. But this, whatever Victor is involved in, it's bigger than business. He killed someone to keep it quiet. Matthew rubbed his chin. The pieces starting to fall into place. Maybe he wasn't just protecting himself. If Graff is involved somehow, it could explain the urgency. Victor wouldn't just lose his reputation. He'd take your father's company down with him. The weight of the realization settled over them. Victor wasn't just trying to silence Lila. He was cleaning up a mess that could destroy his entire world. With no other leads, Matthew decided to call Evan, an old friend from his factory days. Evan had a knack for digging up information, both figuratively and literally. He worked odd jobs as a mechanic now, but his real skill lay in the digital underworld, where he could find connections others missed. Evan answered on the third ring, his voice laced with suspicion. Matthew? Haven't heard from you in years. What's this about? I need a favor, Matthew said, keeping his voice low, and I need you to keep it quiet. After a pause, Evan sighed. This sounds like trouble. What's going on? It's a long story, Matthew replied, but I need to track someone, a man named Victor Carter. Evan whistled softly. Big shot business guy? What's he got to do with you? I can't explain everything right now, but he's dangerous, Matthew said. Can you find anything on him? Associates, movements, anything that can give us an edge. There was a pause before Evan answered. Give me a few hours. And Matthew, whatever mess you're in, be careful. Later that evening, Matthew and Lila sat in the dimly lit room, waiting for Evan's call. The tension was palpable, each passing moment amplifying their unease. Finally, the phone buzzed. I've got something, Evan said without preamble. Victor's name is all over some shady shell companies tied to offshore accounts. But here's the kicker. One of those accounts is linked to a property outside the city. Looks like an old warehouse. Matthew's grip tightened on the phone. Do you have the address? Sending it now, Evan said. But listen, if this guy's as dangerous as you say, don't go in blind. You're not exactly James Bond. Matthew managed a weak chuckle. Thanks, Evan. I owe you. You owe me more than that, Evan muttered before hanging up. The plan was hastily thrown together. Matthew and Lila would drive out to the warehouse to confirm if it was connected to Victor. If they found anything that could expose him, they'd use it to turn the tables. But just as they were about to leave, Matthew's phone buzzed again. It was Evan. Change of plans, Evan said, his tone urgent. I just got a hit. Victor's men are monitoring cell towers near your location. They probably tracked our calls. Matthew's stomach dropped. What are you saying? They're coming for you, Evan said. Get out now. Matthew barely had time to grab his bag before the sound of tires screeching outside sent his heart racing. He peeked through the blinds and saw two black SUVs pull into the lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness. They found us, he hissed, turning to Lila. We have to move. Now. They bolted out the back door, slipping into the shadows as footsteps thundered down the motel hallway. But their escape was short-lived. As they reached the edge of the lot, a group of men emerged from the second SUV, blocking their path. Matthew shoved Lila behind him, gripping the wrench in his bag as his last line of defense. Stay close, he muttered. The men advanced, their faces obscured by hoods. Matthew swung the wrench, catching one attacker in the knee, but he was quickly overpowered. A blow to his side sent him sprawling, the wrench clattering to the ground. Run, he shouted, his voice hoarse. Lila hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but a man grabbed her arm before she could move. She screamed, struggling against his grip, but it was no use. Another man pressed a cloth over her face, and she went limp within seconds. No! Matthew roared, trying to rise, but a heavy boot pinned him to the ground. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Lila being dragged toward the waiting SUV, her body lifeless in their grasp. Matthew woke hours later, his body aching and his head pounding. He was alone in the parking lot, the SUV's long gone. He staggered to his feet, blood trickling from a cut above his brow. For a moment, despair threatened to consume him. He'd failed. They had Lila. But as he looked down, his gaze caught something on the ground, a piece of paper fluttering in the breeze. He picked it up, his hands shaking as he read the hastily scrawled address. The warehouse Evan had mentioned. A surge of determination coursed through him. They thought they'd won, but they had underestimated him. "I'm coming for you, Lila," he whispered, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The night was moonless, and the streets were eerily quiet as Matthew sped through the outskirts of Ashton in Evan's rusted sedan. The glow of the dashboard illuminated his bruised face, and his hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles white against the worn leather. "Slow down," Evan muttered from the passenger seat, clutching his laptop. "We'll be no good to Lila if we crash before we get there." Matthew's jaw clenched, but he eased up on the gas. "We're running out of time. They've got her." Evan glanced at the screen in his lap, where a blinking red dot marked their destination. The abandoned warehouse he'd traced using shell company records tied to Victor. "This is the place," he said, more to himself than to Matthew. "But don't go charging in blind. We don't know how many of them are in there." Matthew's eyes didn't leave the road. "I'm not leaving her in there. I don't care if it's an army." Evan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You're crazy, you know that?" "No," Matthew said, his voice low and steady. "I'm desperate." The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the black sky. Broken windows and rusted siding hinted at years of neglect, but the faint glow of light inside told a different story. Matthew parked the car a few hundred feet away, killing the engine and leaving them in heavy silence. He turned to Evan. "Stay here." Evan raised an eyebrow. "What? And let you go in there alone?" "You're the only one who can get us out if something goes wrong," Matthew said firmly. "Keep the car running. If I don't come back with her, you drive away." Evan hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Be careful." Matthew slipped out of the car, the crowbar he'd grabbed earlier clutched tightly in his hand. The cold night air bit at his skin as he moved silently toward the building, sticking to the shadows. Inside, Lila sat bound to a rickety wooden chair in the center of the warehouse. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering sporadically. Her wrists and ankles throbbed where the ropes dug into her skin, but she didn't cry out. Across the room, Victor stood with his back to her, speaking in low tones to two of his men. Lila strained to hear, catching only fragments of the conversation. "She saw too much," Victor said, his voice sharp. "This ends tonight. No more loose ends." One of the men, a wiry figure with a scar running across his cheek, glanced at Lila. "What about the guy who was with her?" "Dead, for all I care," Victor snapped. "If he's smart, he'll stay that way." Lila's chest tightened, but she kept her face neutral. They thought Matthew was out of the picture. "Good." Matthew crouched near a side entrance, peering through a crack in the rusted door. He could see Lila in the center of the room, her head bowed, but her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Relief flooded him. She was alive. But Victor and his men were armed, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Matthew's pulse quickened as he formulated a plan. He had no illusions about his chances, but he didn't care. He slipped inside, sticking to the shadows as he crept closer. The men were focused on Victor, their backs to him, and Matthew used the distraction to move unnoticed. "All right," Victor said, turning toward Lila. "Let's get this over with." As he approached her, crowbar in hand, Matthew stepped into the light. "Stay away from her." The room fell silent as all eyes snapped to him. Victor's expression twisted in surprise, then fury. "You have a death wish," he spat. Matthew didn't respond. He lunged forward, swinging the crowbar with all his strength. The closest man went down with a sickening thud, but the others were quicker. The second man charged, tackling Matthew to the ground. The crowbar skittered across the floor as they grappled, fists flying. Pain exploded in Matthew's ribs as a boot connected with his side, but he fought back, landing a solid punch to his attacker's jaw. "Stop playing with him," Victor barked. The man with the scar drew a knife, advancing on Matthew. Desperation surged through him as he scrambled backward, his hand closing around a loose pipe on the floor. He swung it upward, the improvised weapon connecting with the man's arm and sending the knife clattering to the ground. Lila watched, her heart pounding, as Matthew fought like a man possessed. She twisted her wrists against the ropes, ignoring the pain as she worked to loosen the knots. Across the room, Victor grabbed a pistol from the table, his face dark with rage. "Enough of this," he growled, raising the weapon. "Matthew!" Lila screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos. He turned just in time to see Victor take aim. Adrenaline coursed through him as he rolled to the side, the gunshot echoing through the warehouse. The bullet missed, ricocheting off a metal beam. Before Victor could fire again, a deafening roar filled the room. The sound of screeching tires and shattering glass erupted as Evan drove the sedan straight through the side of the building. The car skidded to a halt, and Evan leaned out, yelling, "Get in!" Matthew didn't hesitate. He grabbed the falling crowbar and swung it at the man closest to Lila, sending him sprawling. In one swift motion, he cut the ropes binding her wrists and pulled her to her feet. "Can you run?" he asked breathlessly. She nodded, though her legs wobbled beneath her. Together, they sprinted toward the car as Victor's men fired wildly, bullets sparking off the concrete. Evan threw open the passenger door, shouting, "Move, move!" Matthew shoved Lila inside before diving into the back seat. Evan floored the gas, the sedan lurching forward and crashing through another set of doors as they sped into the night. They drove in tense silence, the distant glow of the city lights growing brighter with each passing mile. Lila sat in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, while Matthew slumped in the back, his breathing labored. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Matthew managed a weak nod, though his face was pale and blood streaked his shirt. "I've had worse," he muttered. Evan shot him a glare through the rearview mirror. "You're insane, you know that? I just saved your ass and this car is totaled." "Worth it," Matthew said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Lila turned to him, her eyes filled with gratitude and guilt. "You came back for me." "Of course I did," he replied, his voice softening. "I wasn't going to let them take you." She reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. "Thank you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Lila allowed herself to hope. They had survived, barely, but the fight was far from over. The air in Evan's small apartment felt frozen in place. Lila sat before a laptop, her hands trembling as she adjusted her hair, brushing back loose strands to cover the faint bruises on her face. Matthew stood behind her, arms crossed over his chest, his face lined with tension. Evan was perched at his desk, his fingers flying across the keyboard, setting up the live broadcast. "Are you sure about this?" Evan asked, glancing at Lila over his glasses, his voice tinged with concern. "Once this goes live, Victor will know exactly who's coming for him." Lila nodded, her chin lifting in quiet determination despite the fear lingering in her eyes. "This is the only way. We can't keep running. When the truth is out there, he won't be able to hide behind his money or power anymore." Matthew placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. His deep voice carried an unwavering resolve. "We've got your back. Victor won't get away with this." Lila gave him a faint smile, drawing comfort from his support. Evan tapped a final key and turned to face the camera. "Ready?" Going live in 3, 2, Lila took a deep breath, her gaze locking onto the camera. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with each word. "My name is Lila Carter. 2 nights ago, I was kidnapped and buried alive by men acting under the orders of my stepbrother, Victor Carter. He murdered a man to cover his dark secrets and tried to silence me to protect himself." Her words carried a simmering anger, each syllable cutting through the tension like a blade. "I've spent my whole life being told to stay silent, to look the other way when things weren't right. But not anymore. Victor thinks he's untouchable, that his money and influence can shield him from justice. But today, I'm here to prove him wrong." On the screen, Evan began displaying photographs of Victor and documents tying him to illegal activities, shady financial transactions, shell companies, and links to organized crime. Matthew stood nearby, watching the broadcast with a mixture of admiration and unease. Lila's bravery was undeniable, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Victor wouldn't go down without a fight. As Lila wrapped up her plea, she locked eyes with the camera, her tone urgent and heartfelt. If you know anything about Victor Carter or his associates, please come forward. Share this video. Help me make sure he can't hurt anyone else. Evan ended the broadcast, leaning back in his chair as notifications flooded the screen. Matthew broke the silence. How long until it spreads? Evan smirked, pointing at the alerts lighting up his laptop. It's spreading already. By tomorrow morning, everyone will know Lila's story. Lila leaned back in her chair, exhaling a shaky breath. Will it be enough? Matthew sat down beside her, his expression resolute. It's a start. We've brought the truth into the light. Now we wait. Within hours, Lila's video had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, splashing headlines like Victor Carter, the fall of a powerful family. Social media erupted with hashtags calling for justice, and anonymous tips poured into police hotlines, revealing more of Victor's corrupt web. Under immense public pressure, law enforcement launched an investigation and began gathering preliminary evidence. But to bring Victor down for good, they needed him to incriminate himself. Detective Harlan, a seasoned investigator with years of experience dealing with powerful criminals, sat across from Lila and Matthew in a small meeting room at the police station. His sharp gaze flicked between them as he listened. To their account, what you've provided is valuable, Harlan said after a pause, his tone measured. But Victor isn't just some street-level thug. He's smart, dangerous. That's exactly why we have to act, Lila replied, her voice unwavering. If he's free for even one more day, more people will get hurt. Harlan nodded, his eyes glinting with determination. We'll need him to incriminate himself. And the only way to do that is to set a trap. What kind of trap? Matthew asked, his voice steady but tinged with suspicion. Lila will draw him out, Harlan said bluntly. Victor thinks she's weak, someone he can manipulate. We'll use that to our advantage. A meeting where he thinks he's tying up loose ends. But this time, we'll have everything we need to bring him down. The cafe was quiet, the hum of an espresso machine and soft chatter of patrons barely masking Lila's pounding heart. She sat at a corner table, her hands clasped under the table to hide their trembling. The hidden microphone sewn into her jacket was already live, transmitting every word to the police team stationed nearby. Victor entered with his usual air of arrogance, his tailored suit and icy demeanor, drawing wary glances from other patrons. He slid into the seat across from Lila, his lips curling into a smirk. You've got some nerve, Lila, Victor said, his voice dripping with disdain. I didn't think you'd be brave enough to call me after everything. Don't flatter yourself, Victor, Lila replied evenly. I didn't call you to apologize. I called to end this. Victor's eyes darkened, his smirk fading. End this? After that little stunt you pulled with the video? Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you? Lila shot back, her voice steady. I know everything, Victor. Your deals with Aurora, the shell companies, the offshore accounts. I know you killed Grayson to cover your tracks. Victor stiffened, his expression hardening. Grayson was a fool. He thought he could blackmail me. I did what I had to do to protect this family. Lila's jaw clenched, her fear melting into anger. Protect the family? You try to kill me, Victor. Is that what you call protecting the family? You were a liability, Lila, Victor spat, leaning forward. Always weak. Always in the way. Don't blame me for doing what needed to be done. And what about the money you laundered? She pressed. The lives you destroyed to pad your bank account? Do you think I didn't know about that? Victor's hand slammed down on the table, his face contorted with fury. You don't know anything. You're nothing, Lila. You always have been. Lila met his glare, her voice calm but razor sharp. You underestimated me, Victor, and now you'll pay the price. Before Victor could respond, the cafe erupted in chaos. Shouts and the sound of breaking glass filled the air as officers swarmed the room, guns drawn. Victor Carter, You're under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy." Victor's face twisted in shock and rage as officers cuffed him. "This isn't over," he yelled as they dragged him away. The arrest triggered a wave of investigations. Police raided Victor's properties, uncovering hidden safes containing incriminating financial records, emails, and recordings. Each piece of evidence further dismantled the empire he'd built. In the interrogation room, Victor sat defeated, the arrogance drained from his face. Behind the glass, Lila watched, her shoulders heavy with relief. Matthew placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. "It's over, Lila. He can't hurt anyone anymore." Tears filled her eyes, but they were tears of release, not despair. "Thank you, Matthew, for everything." He smiled faintly. "You did this, Lila. You fought for your life, and you won." Together, they stood in silence, knowing that while the fight had been hard, they'd finally found justice. The sun hung low over the Carter estate, casting long shadows across the sprawling grounds. The towering gates stood open, a rare occurrence that seemed to signal a new chapter for the family. Lila hesitated at the edge of the driveway, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. For the first time in days, her heart wasn't racing with fear, but the weight of what lay ahead was just as daunting. Matthew stood beside her, his presence a steadying force. "You don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. Lila managed a small smile, though her nerves were evident. "I think I do. He needs to hear this from me." Matthew nodded, stepping back to give her space. "I'll be right here." With a deep breath, Lila walked up the stone path to the grand entrance. The door swung open before she could knock, and her father, Arthur Carter, stood in the doorway. His normally commanding presence was softened by the lines of exhaustion etched into his face. "Lila," he said, his voice trembling slightly. He opened his arms hesitantly, as though afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. "Dad," Lila whispered, stepping into his embrace. The hug was tentative at first, but soon it tightened, the shared relief unspoken but deeply felt. When they finally parted, Arthur gestured for her to come inside. The mansion's grand foyer was as imposing as ever, but something about it felt emptier now. The absence of Victor hung in the air like a shadow neither of them could ignore. "I thought I lost you," Arthur said as they sat in the parlor. His voice cracked, and he looked away, his hands clenched tightly together. "When I heard what he did, I can't believe I didn't see it. I failed you." "You didn't fail me, Dad," Lila said softly. "But you let him get away with too much for too long. He needed help, and instead you gave him control." Arthur flinched at her words, but he didn't deny them. "I thought I was doing the right thing, giving him responsibility, letting him prove himself. But I see now that I was blind to what he'd become." Lila reached for his hand, her grip firm despite her own emotions. "What matters is that it's over now. He can't hurt anyone else. And maybe, just maybe we can start over." Arthur nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't deserve it, but I'd like that." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared grief mingling with a fragile sense of hope. For the first time in years, the divide between them seemed less insurmountable. Meanwhile, Matthew waited outside, leaning against the car. He watched the sun dip lower in the sky, the warm hues reflecting off the estate's polished windows. He didn't belong in a place like this, but he stayed for Lila's sake. She deserved to have her moment. The door opened, and Arthur stepped out, his gaze landing on Matthew. He approached with measured steps, extending a hand. "You're Matthew, aren't you?" "Yes, sir," Matthew replied, shaking his hand. Arthur studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Lila told me everything. What you did for her. I don't have words to express my gratitude." "I didn't do it for thanks," Matthew said. "I just couldn't stand by and let her suffer." Arthur nodded, his respect for the young man evident. "Regardless, I owe you a debt, and I'd like to repay it, if you'll let me." Matthew frowned, unsure where this was going. "What do you mean?" Arthur reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is a full scholarship to the university of your choice. Tuition, books, living expenses, all covered." I know from Lila that you've sacrificed a lot to survive. It's time someone gave you a chance to thrive. Matthew stared at the envelope, disbelief flickering across his face. I can't accept this. You can, and you will, Arthur said firmly. You saved my daughter's life. Let me give you something in return. Matthew hesitated, his pride warring with his practicality. Finally, he took the envelope, his voice low. Thank you. Arthur smiled faintly, clapping him on the shoulder. No, Matthew. Thank you. Lila joined them a moment later, her eyes brighter than they'd been in days. Are you two bonding already? Arthur chuckled, the sound lighter than Matthew expected. Something like that. The three of them stood together, the tension that had once loomed over their lives beginning to lift. But as the moment passed, Lila's expression grew more somber. It's time, isn't it? She said, looking at Matthew. He nodded. Yeah, it is. Arthur stepped back, giving them privacy. Lila turned to Matthew, her eyes searching his. I don't know how to say goodbye. You don't have to, he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. This isn't goodbye. It's just a pause. She smiled softly, tears brimming in her eyes. You always know what to say. He shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. I've had a lot of practice. They stood in silence for a moment before Lila reached out, pulling him into a tight hug. You saved me, Matthew. Not just from Victor, but from myself. I'll never forget that. And you saved me, Lila, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. You reminded me that there's more to life than just surviving. When they finally pulled apart, Lila wiped her eyes and smiled through her tears. Promise me you'll use that scholarship. Make something of yourself. I will, Matthew said, his voice resolute. And you? What's next for you? She glanced back at the mansion, her expression thoughtful. I'm going to figure out who I am outside of this family. Start fresh. Matthew nodded, his respect for her growing with every word. You'll do great. I know it. As the sun dipped below the aurora, casting the world in shades of gold and amber, they said their final goodbyes. Lila watched as Matthew climbed into Evan's car and drove away, his silhouette fading into the distance. Her heart ached, but it was a bittersweet ache, tempered by the knowledge that they were both heading toward brighter futures. For the first time in years, the path ahead felt open, filled with possibilities. And though they were parting ways, Lila knew their bond would remain unbroken, no matter where life took them. The autumn breeze swept across the college campus, rustling the golden leaves that blanketed the green lawns. Students walked between buildings with books tucked under their arms, their conversations and laughter filling the crisp air. Among them was Matthew, his backpack slung over one shoulder, a notebook in hand. He looked like any other student, but the determined set of his jaw and the focus in his eyes hinted at a story much deeper than most would guess. Matthew paused at the library steps, glancing up at the towering structure. It had been weeks since he started classes, yet the surrealness of being here hadn't worn off. He adjusted his bag and climbed the steps, weaving through students sprawled across tables. Finding an empty seat by the window, he opened his notebook and began scribbling ideas for his essay on ethics and justice, topics that felt closer to his life than ever before. As he worked, his phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, smiling faintly at the message. See you soon. Lila. True to her word, Lila arrived an hour later. She entered the library quietly, her confident stride catching the attention of a few nearby students. Her long coat trailed behind her as she made her way to Matthew's table. You look different, she said, dropping into the chair across from him. Matthew smirked, leaning back in his seat. So do you. I guess we're both trying out this whole new beginnings thing. Lila smiled, though her expression was tinged with nostalgia. It suits you. College life. He shrugged. It's an adjustment, but I like it. Feels good to be working towards something. Lila studied him for a moment, her gaze softening. I knew you'd do well here. You've always had the drive, just needed the opportunity. They fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, catching up on the time that had passed since their parting. Lila shared updates about her father, Arthur, who had stepped back from his company to focus on repairing their fractured family. She herself had begun working with a nonprofit aimed at helping survivors of abuse and trauma, channeling her experiences into something meaningful. It's not always easy, she admitted, stirring her coffee. There are days when the past feels too close, but I remind myself that I have a choice now. I can use it to help others or let it define me. Matthew nodded, his respect for her deepening. You've come a long way, Lila. I'm proud of you. Her cheeks flushed slightly, but she met his gaze. And you? How's the essay coming along? He chuckled. Let's just say I'm learning that writing about justice is a lot easier than living it. Their laughter faded into a comfortable silence as they watched the campus come alive outside the window. Students walked by, some lost in thought, others chatting animatedly. It was a world of possibility, a stark contrast to the darkness they'd fought through together. I still think about it sometimes, Lila said quietly. The night you found me, how everything could have turned out so differently. Matthew turned to her, his expression thoughtful. You survived because you're stronger than you think. And you reminded me that doing the right thing isn't about guarantees. It's about trying, no matter how impossible it feels. Lila smiled, her eyes glistening. You changed my life, Matthew. You gave me a second chance when I thought there was nothing left. And you gave me hope, he replied, his voice steady. Before I met you, I wasn't living. I was just getting by. But now, for the first time, I could see a future worth fighting for. As the afternoon wore on, they wandered through the campus, their conversation weaving between the past and the future. They talked about their dreams, their fears, and the lessons they'd learned from their harrowing journey. One of the most profound realizations they shared was how resilience wasn't just about surviving. It was about finding strength in vulnerability, in letting others in. Lila had spent years building walls to protect herself, and Matthew had buried his pain beneath a facade of independence. But together, they discovered the power of trust and connection. The hardest part, Lila said, pausing beneath a massive oak tree, was letting myself believe that someone would stay, that I wasn't alone. Matthew nodded, his gaze steady. I know the feeling. It's easier to push people away than to risk losing them. But life's too short to live like that. Lila looked up at the branches swaying in the breeze, her expression wistful. Do you think Victor ever felt that way? Like he was alone? The question hung in the air, heavy with the complexity of their shared history. Maybe, Matthew said after a moment. But the difference is he let that loneliness turn into hate. You chose something better. She nodded, though her heart ached for the brother she'd lost long before his arrest. I hope one day he finds peace. For all our sakes. As the sun dipped lower, painting the campus in hues of gold and crimson, they returned to the library steps. Lila turned to Matthew, her expression a mix of gratitude and bittersweet emotion. You got a good thing going here, she said. Don't waste it. I won't, he promised. And you keep doing what you're doing. The world needs more people like you. They embraced one last time, the weight of their journey together giving way to a lighter, hopeful air. As Lila walked away, Matthew watched her go, a small smile playing on his lips. For all the darkness they'd endured, this moment felt like the start of something brighter, a testament to the strength of second chances and the unyielding power of hope. As Matthew returned to his seat in the library, he opened his notebook, pen poised above the blank page. For the first time in years, his thoughts weren't clouded by fear or doubt. He was ready to build something new, to make good on the promise of a better future. The story he was writing wasn't just for a grade. It was for him, for Lila, for everyone who needed to believe that even in the darkest moments, light could find its way through. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this heartfelt story. We wish you a joyful and warm Christmas filled with love and happiness. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join us for more inspiring stories to come. See you in the next one.